San Francisco, 1989. San Francisco in 1989 was a city caught between eras. Steel and glass were rising where brick once stood. Old neighborhoods were being redrawn by architects who believed cities could be improved through precision, foresight, and design. The skyline was changing, and so were the people shaping it. Eleanor Holloway was one of them. At 23 years old, she was already doing what many only planned to do someday. Fresh out of graduate school, Eleanor worked as a junior architect at a small but ambitious firm just south of Market Street. She wasn't famous, she wasn't wealthy, but she was trusted with drafting plans that would eventually become real spaces people lived and worked in. She believed buildings should tell the truth about the people inside them. That belief showed in her work. Her designs favored light, openness, and flow. She avoided excessive ornamentation. She hated wasted space. Every line had a reason. Every angle had purpose. Colleagues described her as precise, not cold, quiet, not withdrawn. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, people paid attention, because she rarely wasted words. She lived alone in a modest apartment in the Mission District, a neighborhood that still carried grit beneath its color. The building was old but solid, the kind of place that creaked honestly when you walked across the floor. Eleanor liked that. She liked things that revealed their age instead of pretending it didn't exist. Her routine was predictable. Morning coffee at the same corner cafe, streetcar commute, long hours hunched over drafting tables, late evenings reviewing notes, adjusting lines, erasing and redrawing until things felt right. Friends worried she worked too much. Eleanor disagreed. She didn't see it as work. She saw it as preparation for a future she was carefully designing piece by piece. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't disappear for days at a time. Her life left patterns, and patterns are supposed to make disappearance impossible. Which is why, when Eleanor Holloway didn't show up for work one Monday morning in October of 1989, it was noticed immediately. At first, no one panicked. She was young. She lived alone. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she overslept. Someone joked that architects were notorious for working late and forgetting the clock. By noon, the joking stopped. Eleanor had never missed a deadline, never missed a meeting without notice. Her desk sat exactly as she had left it on Friday evening, drafts aligned, pencils sharpened, notes clipped neatly together. There was no message, no call, no explanation. A colleague walked to the cafe Eleanor visited every morning. The barista shook his head. She hadn't been there. By late afternoon, concern hardened into something heavier. Her supervisor called her apartment. No answer. A friend stopped by that evening. The lights were off. The mailbox hadn't been disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no noise, no neighbors reporting anything unusual. It looked normal, and that was the first mistake. When Eleanor was officially reported missing, the response reflected the assumptions of the time. She was an adult. She had no history of instability, no known threats, no obvious signs of danger. The initial classification leaned toward voluntary absence. San Francisco saw disappearances like this more often than people admitted. Young professionals came to the city to reinvent themselves, and sometimes they left without explanation. That narrative was convenient. Too convenient, because it fit without requiring questions. Investigators noted that Eleanor had withdrawn a small amount of cash days earlier. That detail was logged, then amplified. It became evidence of intent rather than a routine transaction. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle. That absence was interpreted as proof rather than possibility. Her personal belongings remained untouched. Sketches, notebooks, architectural manuals filled with marginal notes. Her passport was still inside a drawer. So was most of her clothing. but those details were minimized. The case file began to shape itself around a conclusion before the facts had finished speaking. Eleanor Holloway, age 23, architect, likely left of her own accord. Once written, that assumption guided everything that followed. Search efforts were brief, interviews were limited, leads that contradicted the narrative were quietly deprioritized. The city moved on, as cities do, forward, upward, without looking back. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Eleanor's name faded from conversations, then from memory. Her absence became a footnote in a city overflowing with stories. But absence does not mean erasure, it only means delay. Because what no one realized in 1989 was that Eleanor Holloway's disappearance was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a 31-year silence, one built not from mystery, but from assumptions left unchallenged. San Francisco, 1989. The weekend Eleanor Holloway disappeared was unremarkable in ways that later felt unsettling. There were no dramatic phone calls, no heated arguments overheard through thin apartment walls, no sudden changes in routine that would have suggested escape or urgency. Friday ended the way most of her Fridays did. Eleanor left the office shortly after 6, carrying a rolled set of drawings secured with a rubber band she reused too many times. She stopped at the corner cafe on her walk home, ordered her usual, and spoke briefly with the barista about a renovation project happening down the street. Witnesses would later recall nothing unusual, no agitation, no haste, no fear. She walked home alone. Her building's entryway camera, primitive by modern standards, caught a grainy image of her unlocking the door just before 7. It was the last confirmed image of Eleanor Holloway. Inside her apartment, the environment told a story that investigators did not initially hear. Her drafting table was still extended, blueprints weighted down at the corners. A kettle sat cold on the stove, untouched. Her bed was made, not neatly but habitually, the way someone leaves it when they expect to return. Her purse rested on a chair, wallet inside. Identification untouched. Keys missing. That absence should have mattered. Instead, it was rationalized. Investigators noted that Eleanor often took evening walks, that she sometimes carried her keys separately from her purse, that the Mission District, while rough around the edges, was not considered exceptionally dangerous. Each explanation stood on its own. Together, they formed avoidance. Neighbors were interviewed briefly. One mentioned hearing raised voices late Friday night, not screaming, just sharp tones like disagreement. The comment was logged, then dismissed. Apartment buildings carried sound. Voices traveled. Another neighbor recalled seeing Eleanor speaking with someone near the building entrance earlier that evening, a man she did not recognize. That detail was also logged, then deprioritized. San Francisco was full of strangers. No composite sketch was produced. No follow-up interviews were conducted after the first week. The case settled into paperwork. Within days, Eleanor's employer began receiving phone calls. Clients wanted updates. Deadlines loomed. The firm quietly redistributed her workload, assuming she would return, until it became clear she would not. Friends pressed law enforcement for more aggressive action. They described Eleanor's nature, cautious, methodical, deeply rooted in her plans. She had been excited about an upcoming project, saving for a better apartment, talking about licensure exams. These were not the behaviors of someone preparing to disappear. But enthusiasm does not override classification. Once investigators decided Eleanor had likely left voluntarily, every detail was filtered through that assumption. Contradictions were smoothed over. Inconsistencies were reframed as misunderstandings. Her bank activity became a focal point. The small cash withdrawal, insignificant in isolation, was treated as symbolic, evidence of planning, proof of intent. What was not examined was what Eleanor did not do. She did not empty her account. She did not pack belongings. She did not leave notes, not to friends, not to family, not even to herself in the margins of her notebooks. Architects document everything. Eleanor documented nothing about leaving. Her parents flew in from out of state within days. They walked through her apartment slowly, touching familiar objects as if proximity might explain absence. Her mother noticed something missing immediately, a slim portfolio Eleanor carried everywhere, containing personal sketches unrelated to work. That portfolio was never recovered. It was mentioned once in the report. No follow-up questions appear in the file. Time moved forward. Weeks after the disappearance, a possible sighting was reported near the waterfront. A young woman resembling Eleanor, speaking with someone older, appearing uncomfortable. The report lacked certainty, and without urgency, it faded. Months later, another tip came in. A former colleague claimed Eleanor had mentioned feeling uneasy about someone she encountered during her commute. No name, no details, just unease. That too was filed away. What no one acknowledged openly was that Eleanor Holloway did not vanish in a vacuum. She disappeared within systems, transit systems, professional systems, residential systems, all of which left traces. Those traces were never fully mapped. By early 1990, the case activity slowed to a crawl. Eleanor's file became one of many, stacked in cabinets where unresolved questions went quiet. New cases took priority. Fresh urgency replaced old uncertainty. The city continued building. Structures rose where others fell. Streets changed. People moved in and out. Eleanor's designs, some of them, were constructed by others. Her lines transformed into physical spaces she would never walk through. Her absence became normalized, but normalization is not resolution. For years, Eleanor's parents called periodically, asking if there had been any movement. The answers were polite and vague. No new leads, no updates, no changes in status. Eventually, the calls slowed, not because they stopped caring, but because hope, when repeatedly unanswered, learns to retreat. The assumption that Eleanor left voluntarily hardened into institutional memory. New detectives inherited the file already shaped by that conclusion. Few questioned it. Fewer challenged it. Why would they? There was no body, no crime scene, no clear suspect. And yet, there was no Eleanor. The case remained technically open, but functionally dormant. What no one in 1989 could have predicted was that the same details dismissed as insignificant would become critical decades later, when technology, perspective, and accountability finally caught up. Because assumptions age poorly, and Eleanor Holloway's disappearance was built on assumptions that time would eventually expose. Cities are not just built from concrete and steel. They are built from systems, transit systems, housing systems, professional systems, policing systems, each designed with the belief that if every part functions as intended, people remain protected. When Eleanor Holloway disappeared, every system surrounding her technically functioned. That was the problem. In 1989, San Francisco was undergoing rapid transformation. Redevelopment projects were reshaping neighborhoods, zoning laws were being renegotiated, and an influx of young professionals was altering the social fabric of the city. Eleanor had entered this environment as both participant and observer, someone who understood how systems were meant to work and how easily they could fail when pressure was unevenly applied. Ironically, the same blind spots she studied professionally were the ones that swallowed her case. Transportation records were never fully analyzed. Eleanor relied heavily on public transit, often adjusting routes based on time, weather, or workload. Investigators assumed routine usage meant predictability. It did not. Transit logs from the period were incomplete, but not non-existent. Ticketing systems, station attendants, maintenance schedules, all left data trails. Those trails were never requested in full. Why? because the prevailing theory did not require them. If Eleanor left voluntarily, her movements were irrelevant. Tracking them would only complicate a narrative already deemed sufficient. Housing systems fared no better. The Mission District in the late 1980s existed in a transitional state, neither fully gentrified nor neglected enough to trigger consistent oversight. Tenant records were fragmented. Informal subletting was common. Building access was loose. Eleanor's apartment building had multiple points of entry, some unofficial. Residents came and went. Security relied more on familiarity than enforcement. That environment created opportunity, but opportunity was never examined. Professionally, Eleanor occupied a space that should have generated more scrutiny. Architecture firms maintain records, client lists, site visits, project meetings. Eleanor's calendar showed several appointments that were never cross-referenced with her disappearance. One meeting scheduled the week after she vanished involved a site visit to a redevelopment area near the waterfront. The meeting was cancelled quietly. No one asked why Eleanor hadn't mentioned it earlier. No one asked who else was expected to attend. The assumption of voluntary absence again neutralized curiosity. Even communication systems failed. Eleanor's phone records were sparse by modern standards, but patterns existed. Calls she made regularly stopped abruptly. Messages went unanswered. The sudden silence was absolute, a red flag that should have triggered urgency. Instead, it was interpreted as intention. She didn't want to be found became the explanation for why she wasn't. That phrase did immense damage. It excused inaction. It reframed concern as intrusion. It transformed disappearance into preference. Years passed and Eleanor's case slipped further into obscurity. Internally, it was categorized as inactive but open, a designation that sounds responsible but functions as storage. Occasionally, new detectives reviewed old cases for training exercises. Eleanor's file was one of many. Notes were skimmed, conclusions were inherited. The logic went unquestioned. Architects understand load-bearing elements, remove the wrong one and collapse follows. Eleanor's case rested on a single load-bearing assumption, voluntary departure. No one tested its integrity. In the mid-1990s, the city experienced renewed attention on unresolved cases, driven partly by public pressure and partly by advances in record-keeping. Eleanor's case was briefly flagged for review. The review was superficial. A memo noted no new information and reaffirmed the existing classification. The memo cited lack of evidence, ignoring that evidence cannot exist if it is never sought. This pattern repeated. Every few years, Eleanor's name resurfaced briefly, then sank again. Each time, the same justification applied. Nothing new to pursue. But something had been missed, and missed things do not disappear. They wait. What investigators failed to recognize was that Eleanor's profession placed her in contact with people outside her immediate social circle, contractors, consultants, clients, site managers. These interactions were transactional, brief, and often undocumented beyond meeting notes. Those notes existed. They were never cross-referenced with missing persons data, never examined for irregularities, never considered as potential points of vulnerability. In architecture, sites under development are liminal spaces, not yet public, no longer private. They attract activity without oversight. Eleanor knew this. She had written about it in school, warning about design gaps that allowed harm to go unnoticed. Her disappearance echoed her warnings, but no one connected them. As the years stretched into decades, Eleanor Holloway became less a person and more a concept, a name attached to an unsolved file. The emotional urgency faded, replaced by administrative distance. Her parents aged, Her peers moved on. Her designs lived on anonymously in the city's fabric. The systems that failed her were not malicious. They were indifferent. And indifference, when institutionalized, is powerful. It wasn't until the late 2010s, when cold cases began re-emerging under public scrutiny, that Eleanor's disappearance was forced back into the light. Journalists examining unresolved cases noticed something unsettling about hers. It was too clean, too few contradictions recorded, too little friction in the narrative. Voluntary disappearance had smoothed every rough edge, eliminating the messiness that real life produces. That observation triggered renewed interest. For the first time, someone asked not whether Eleanor had left, but whether the systems around her had allowed her to vanish without consequence. That question changed everything. Because once systems are examined, accountability follows. And Eleanor Holloway's case was about to reveal how thoroughly those systems had failed, not all at once, but layer by layer. Over 31 years of silence. For more than 2 decades, Eleanor Holloway's disappearance existed inside a sealed narrative. She left. She chose distance. She did not want to be found. Those statements were repeated so often they hardened into fact, not because they were proven, but because they were convenient. They required no reconstruction, no confrontation, no admission that something had gone wrong. But convenience has a shelf life. By the late 2010s, unresolved cases across California were being re-examined under public pressure and technological advancement. Patterns once accepted were being challenged. Assumptions once defended were being dismantled. Eleanor's case resurfaced not because of new evidence, but because of an old inconsistency that no longer made sense. A graduate student researching urban redevelopment and personal safety requested access to historical missing persons cases involving professionals working in transitional neighborhoods. Eleanor's name appeared unexpectedly, categorized as voluntary disappearance, yet surrounded by details that contradicted the label. The student noticed something subtle. The file lacked escalation. Most voluntary disappearances show gradual withdrawal, communication slowing, assets dispersing, social disengagement. Eleanor's case showed none of that. Her life stopped abruptly. That observation found its way into a longer report, then into a journalist's inbox. The journalist did what no one had done since 1989. They read the entire file without accepting its conclusion. What they found was absence masquerading as certainty. Interview summaries referenced conversations that were never transcribed. Witness statements were paraphrased instead of quoted. Timelines were approximate where they should have been precise. More importantly, several names appeared only once, mentioned briefly, never revisited. One of those names belonged to a consultant Eleanor had interacted with during a redevelopment project near the waterfront. The interaction was noted as routine, then ignored. No interview transcript existed. No follow-up documentation appeared in the file. The journalist requested additional records. What came back was incomplete. That incompleteness became the story. When the article published, it did not accuse. It questioned. It highlighted discrepancies without asserting conclusions. It asked why Eleanor's case had been resolved without resolution. Public response was immediate. Former colleagues contacted the journalist privately, sharing memories that had never been formally recorded. One recalled Eleanor mentioning discomfort after a site visit, not fear, but unease. Another remembered her declining an invitation she would normally accept, citing exhaustion she did not elaborate on. None of these details proved anything. Together, they dismantled the certainty of the original narrative. Under renewed attention, the department announced a formal internal review. The language was careful. The intent was framed as modernization, not correction. But internally, the tone was different. Detectives assigned to the review approached the file as if it were new. They stripped away the voluntary disappearance classification and examined the raw material beneath it. What they found was troubling. Key locations Eleanor frequented had never been canvassed thoroughly. Transit nodes were assumed irrelevant. Redevelopment sites, inherently vulnerable spaces, were never treated as potential risk environments. One location emerged repeatedly, an unfinished structure near the waterfront tied to a project Eleanor had consulted on briefly. It had been active during the week she disappeared, then stalled shortly after. No one had asked who was present there after hours. No one had documented access logs. No one had questioned why Eleanor's personal sketch portfolio, distinct from her work materials, had vanished. As these details resurfaced, the voluntary disappearance narrative began to collapse under its own weight. It could no longer account for what Eleanor left behind, or what was taken. In 2020, the case reached a threshold. Investigators formally acknowledged that the original classification could no longer be supported by the evidence, not because new proof had emerged, but because the old proof had never existed. The case was reclassified as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. That change altered everything. It expanded investigative authority. It reopened dormant leads. It legitimized questions that had once been dismissed as emotional rather than evidentiary. People who had stayed silent began to speak. Some cited fear of involvement. Others cited belief that authorities already knew what happened. A few admitted they hadn't been asked anything at all. 31 years after Eleanor Holloway vanished, the truth was no longer buried by mystery. It was buried by assumption. And once that assumption fell, the case could no longer remain quiet. The city that Eleanor helped design now had to confront a void it had helped ignore. Because when the story finally cracked, it did not reveal chaos. It revealed negligence, sustained, normalized, and inherited. And that negligence was about to face daylight. Cold cases do not reopen because of hope. They reopen because something no longer fits. By 2020, Eleanor Holloway's disappearance had reached that point. The reclassification stripped away the comfort of the original explanation and replaced it with responsibility. Once the case was no longer framed as voluntary absence, every unanswered question became active again. And there were many. The internal review expanded into a full reinvestigation. Investigators approached the file not as caretakers of a conclusion, but as challengers of one. They rebuilt the timeline from the ground up, refusing to rely on summaries written decades earlier. That process revealed how much had been lost, not to time, but to assumption. The first phase focused on Eleanor's final 48 hours. Not broadly, precisely. Every confirmed interaction, movement, and deviation was mapped. Patterns emerged that had never been examined together. Eleanor's last confirmed evening placed her at the edge of several overlapping environments: residential, commercial, and transitional redevelopment zones. Areas with shifting oversight, temporary access permissions, and inconsistent records. In 1989, those environments were considered background. In 2020, they became focal points. Investigators tracked down individuals connected to redevelopment projects Eleanor had consulted on. Some were difficult to locate, others had passed away. Records were fragmented, companies dissolved, permits expired, logs discarded. Still, interviews proceeded. What emerged was not a singular revelation, but a repeated theme. Eleanor had been conscientious to the point of caution. She documented meetings carefully. She voiced concerns about site safety. She avoided being alone in unfamiliar spaces whenever possible. That pattern contradicted the idea that she would simply walk away from her life without preparation. Another detail resurfaced with new significance: Eleanor's missing personal portfolio. Unlike her work materials, which remained untouched, this portfolio contained conceptual sketches, private notes, and early designs, a personal archive she guarded closely. Its absence suggested selection. Someone knew what to take. Digital forensics, limited as they were for a 1989 case, were applied retroactively. Phone records were reanalyzed using modern pattern recognition. The abrupt halt in outgoing calls stood out, not as withdrawal, but as interruption. Her last known communications showed no farewell tone, no emotional distancing, no hints of departure. Instead, they ended mid-life. The review team presented their findings internally. The conclusion was unavoidable. Eleanor Holloway's disappearance had been prematurely categorized, and that categorization had dictated 3 decades of inaction. The department issued a public update in early 2021. The language was restrained but historic. Officials acknowledged that the original handling of the case did not meet current investigative standards, and that assumptions made at the time had limited follow-up. It was not an apology, but it was an admission. For the first time, Eleanor's name re-entered public consciousness, not as a footnote, but as a question. Media coverage followed, measured, investigative, unsensational. Articles emphasized process failure rather than speculation. They highlighted how easily a narrative can replace evidence when urgency fades. Public response was mixed. Some expressed shock that a disappearance could be set aside so easily. Others defended past practices, citing limitations of the era. But even defenders conceded one point. Eleanor's case should have been examined more thoroughly. That concession mattered, because once an institution admits that more should have been done, it opens the door to what else might have been ignored. As the 31st anniversary approached, the case reached a new phase. Investigators revisited physical locations tied to Eleanor's last known movements, not to find preserved evidence, but to understand opportunity. Redevelopment sites were studied for historical access patterns. Nighttime activity was reconstructed through employment records, maintenance schedules, and informal testimony. It became clear that several sites Eleanor frequented had lax after-hours oversight. People moved through them unnoticed. Accountability was minimal. In 1989, this was considered normal. In hindsight, it was exposure. The investigation did not produce a dramatic breakthrough. No confession surfaced. No definitive proof emerged to rewrite the ending cleanly. Instead, it produced something more unsettling. A realization that Eleanor Holloway's disappearance was never unsolvable. It had simply been allowed to remain unsolved. By mid-2021, the department confirmed that Eleanor's case was being actively pursued under modern investigative standards. The announcement did not promise resolution. It promised persistence, and persistence, after 31 years of silence, was itself an indictment. The truth was no longer buried beneath mystery. It was buried beneath decisions. Decisions that had been made quickly, repeated often, and defended for decades, until they could no longer withstand examination. Eleanor Holloway had been 23 years old when she disappeared, an architect designing spaces meant to endure. What endured instead was the absence left by a system that mistook quiet for closure. That mistake was finally being confronted. But confrontation is not the same as conclusion. The final reckoning still lay ahead. Truth does not surface because time heals. It surfaces because time exposes what silence was protecting. By the 31st year after Eleanor Holloway vanished, the story that once shielded her disappearance had eroded beyond repair. The reclassification had reopened the door, but it was what followed. The sustained attention, the re-interviews, the recontextualization that forced the city of San Francisco to confront what had been allowed to disappear along with her. The uncovering did not arrive as a single revelation. It arrived as convergence. Investigators began receiving information that, decades earlier, would have sounded uncertain. Now it aligned. Former contractors recalled late-night access to redevelopment sites. Maintenance workers described unlocked structures and informal entry practices that blurred responsibility. A former transit employee remembered seeing a young woman matching Eleanor's description speaking tensely with someone near a restricted area, a memory dismissed at the time as insignificant. Individually, none of it solved the case. Collectively, it rewrote its meaning. The investigation confirmed what Eleanor's friends had always insisted. She had not left by choice. Her life did not show withdrawal. It showed interruption, the kind that occurs when plans are cut short, not abandoned. In early 2021, officials held a press briefing that avoided spectacle but carried weight. They acknowledged that Eleanor Holloway's disappearance had been mishandled from the outset. The voluntary departure assumption, they said, had limited investigative scope. That phrase did heavy work because limiting scope meant limiting urgency. Limiting urgency meant limiting effort, and limiting effort meant allowing years to pass without answers. The city that Eleanor helped shape now had to confront its own reflection. Her profession became part of the reckoning. Architects design with foresight, accounting for stress points, failure modes, and unintended consequences. Eleanor had done this instinctively. She understood that systems fail not from collapse, but from neglect. Her case proved her right. The uncovering did not end with arrest announcements or courtroom scenes. It ended with acknowledgement, public, documented, irreversible. Eleanor Holloway was no longer classified as someone who disappeared willingly. She was recognized as someone whose disappearance was enabled by systemic blind spots and protected by institutional inertia. That recognition mattered, because it restored her story to accuracy, and accuracy is the foundation of justice, even when justice arrives incomplete. Guilt, CTA, Buon. If you're listening to this and thinking someone else would have pushed harder, understand this. Cases like Eleanor Holloway's survive on the assumption that attention is optional. It isn't. Every moment of disengagement becomes permission for silence to continue. If you care enough to be here, care enough not to walk away when it matters. The case remains officially unresolved. There is no clean ending, no definitive answer that satisfies the ache left by absence. But there is a reckoning. Departments revised missing persons protocols. Voluntary departure classifications were tightened. Older cases were flagged for reassessment. Eleanor's name appeared in training materials, not as a mystery, but as a lesson. Her disappearance became evidence of what happens when certainty replaces curiosity. The city did not solve Eleanor Holloway's case, but it stopped pretending it had. That distinction matters, because pretending is how time gets wasted, and wasted time is the one thing missing people cannot afford. Eleanor was 23 years old, an architect designing permanence. Her work remains scattered through San Francisco, lines drawn by a mind that believed in durability. What failed to endure was the protection she deserved. Guilt, CTA, you were two. If you've ever wondered how cases disappear from public memory, look at how easy it is to consume a story and move on. Not subscribing is a choice, one that quietly tells the algorithm, the platform, and the culture that these stories can fade again. Attention is pressure. Pressure is accountability. And accountability is the only thing that makes systems change. 31 years after Eleanor Holloway vanished, her story stands as a warning, not about danger lurking in the shadows, but about what happens when institutions grow comfortable with incomplete answers. Her case teaches that disappearance is not always a mystery. Sometimes it is a decision not to look deeper, a decision not to challenge assumptions, a decision to let time do the forgetting. That decision has consequences. The final reckoning in Eleanor Holloway's story is not about who took her or where she went. It is about how long a city allowed itself not to know, and how many similar stories might still be waiting beneath familiar explanations. Eleanor did not vanish into obscurity. She was left there, and only sustained attention pulled her back into truth. If you've made it this far, you already understand something most people don't. Silence is not neutral. Subscribing isn't about supporting a channel. It's about refusing to let stories like Eleanor Holloway's be buried under convenience ever again. Because the moment attention disappears, so does accountability. And Eleanor deserved better than silence. Twice.